Good evening, my name is Sarah Johnson. I was born in a small town in rural Ohio, United States, where I spent my childhood in a home filled with inspiring stories. My father, a brave firefighter, always told me gripping tales of how he had saved lives in emergency situations, instilling in me a deep admiration for his courage and dedication. On the other hand, my mother, a loving and caring teacher, taught me from an early age the importance of treating everyone with compassion and respect, just as she did with her students. From a very young age, I felt a strong inclination to care for and help people. I used to play nurse with my toys, imagining ways to alleviate the suffering of those in need of attention. This passion grew even stronger during my high school years, where I excelled in science and biology classes, dreaming of one day turning this calling into a career. After graduating, determined to follow my heart, I enrolled in the nursing program at Ohio State University. During my years of study, I dedicated myself with extreme empathy and perseverance, always ready to help my peers and provide the best possible care to the patients we attended to. In 2007, I graduated with honors and was hired by a local hospital where I could start my professional career. Since I started working at the local hospital right after graduating, my professional life has been a journey filled with challenges, learning, and profound gratification. Initially, I was assigned to the emergency department, where I could put into practice all the knowledge and skills I had developed during college. Dealing with urgent and emergency situations was extremely demanding, both physically and emotionally. Witnessing the suffering of people and having to act quickly to save lives was intense, but at the same time, it drove me to give my best at every interaction. Over time, I specialized in intensive care, constantly seeking to improve and acquire new knowledge. This area fascinated me because it allowed me to develop a deeper connection with my patients, closely monitoring their recovery process. Each victory, each smile of relief on a patient's face who managed to recover, filled my heart with joy and reaffirmed how gratifying the profession I chose is. Over the years, I gained the trust and respect of my colleagues and superiors. My dedication, empathy, and technical skills earned me promotions and leadership opportunities within the hospital. I began coordinating teams, training new professionals, and actively participating in decisions about patient care. Despite the challenging moments, such as dealing with the pain of losing a patient or facing the physical and emotional toll of working in healthcare, I never lost my passion for what I do. Every day I feel rewarded to be there, making a difference in people's lives, applying my knowledge and my whole heart to help them recover and return to their loved ones. I vividly remember a particularly frightening night while working in the emergency department of the hospital. It was a busy shift, with the emergency room full and the team running back and forth to attend all the incoming patients. Suddenly, I heard the sound of sirens approaching, and a few minutes later, the doors burst open. An ambulance team rushed in, pushing a stretcher with a man who seemed unconscious. They informed me that it was a car accident involving multiple vehicles on the main highway. Immediately, I sprang into action along with my colleagues to stabilize the patient. His injuries looked severe: head trauma, multiple fractures, and heavy bleeding. We needed to act fast to prevent him from dying. As we began the procedures, I noticed that his level of consciousness was diminishing. His vital signs were dangerously fluctuating, and the medical team seemed to be racing against time. Everything was happening in a frenetic pace, with all of us shouting orders and coordinating our efforts to keep him alive. At one point, the cardiac monitor started emitting an alarming sound, indicating that his heart had stopped. Without hesitation, we started cardiopulmonary resuscitation maneuvers, applying chest compressions and administering emergency medications. My heart was racing as I prayed internally that we could restore his heart function. The minutes seemed to drag on like hours as we tirelessly fought to revive the patient. All eyes were fixed on the monitor, expecting to see that flatline turn into a regular heartbeat. It was then that, after what seemed like an eternity, we heard the awaited sound, the continuous beep indicating that his heart had started beating again. Relieved, but still tense, we continued with the necessary care, stabilizing his vital signs and performing additional tests to assess the extent of the damage. That battle had been arduous, but we managed to keep him alive. Hours later, after the patient had been transferred to the ICU, I finally sat down and caught my breath. My whole body was shaking, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. That experience had left me deeply shaken, but at the same time, it reaffirmed the importance of my work and the need to always be prepared to deal with emergency situations. However, something unexpected happened during the night. While doing rounds in the hospital corridors, I heard a strange noise coming from the ICU wing. Cautiously, I approached and to my astonishment, saw the door of the room of the patient we had attended to open on its own. A chill ran down my spine. Hesitant, I decided to enter the room to check what was happening. To my surprise, the patient was sitting on his bed, staring at me with a lost look. As I approached, he turned slowly towards me and with a hoarse and anguished voice murmured, "They won't stop haunting me." My heart froze at that moment. I didn't know what to think or do. Was that man experiencing hallucinations? Or was there something supernatural happening there? My mind went into panic, but I tried to stay calm and call the medical team to assess the situation. After that incident, I remained attentive to any unusual signs in the hospital. I remember a different horrifying night that happened during my hospital shift. Everything was going normally, until an urgent call came to the emergency department. Quickly, I headed to the indicated location, where I found a group of colleagues gathered around a patient in critical condition. It was an elderly woman who had been found unconscious in her home, with head injuries. Without wasting time, we started the medical procedures to stabilize her. Her clinical condition was concerning: unstable vital signs, head trauma, and severe bleeding. We all worked hard to keep her alive, shouting orders and performing resuscitation maneuvers. As we worked, I noticed something unusual on the cardiac monitor. The patient's heart rate seemed to fluctuate in an unnatural way, as if there was an external interference. Confused, I drew the medical team's attention to it, and they also noticed the phenomenon. Before we could investigate further, the lights in the room started flickering intensely, and the cardiac monitor emitted a sharp and loud alert signal indicating a cardiac arrest. Again, we launched into the desperate attempt to revive the patient, but something seemed to be hindering our efforts. Looking around, I noticed that all electronic equipment, from lighting to monitors, showed interferences, as if there was a supernatural presence in the room. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt an intense fear take hold of me. Even amidst the chaos, I kept my focus and continued applying the cardiopulmonary resuscitation maneuvers. However, as time passed, I realized that the patient was not responding to our efforts. Her vital signs simply didn't stabilize. Frustrated and scared, I took a few steps back, watching the scene in disbelief. It was then that I noticed something that disturbed me even more. The room's door closed on its own, as if a supernatural force had pushed it. At that moment, panic took over all of us. Some colleagues huddled in a corner, whispering prayers, while others tried to force the door open. I, paralyzed, just watched, unable to move. Suddenly, a piercing scream followed by a deafening static noise filled the room. The cardiac monitor went completely haywire, displaying distorted lines and shapes, until the screen turned completely white. At that moment, the patient's eyes shot open so abruptly that it startled me. Her gaze was empty and disturbing, and she let out a guttural groan that sent shivers down my spine. Instinctively, I stepped back even more, feeling my heart race. Then, to my horror, she got up from the stretcher, as if nothing had happened, and started approaching us. My colleagues screamed in panic, trying to restrain the patient, but her movements seemed superhuman, as if she was not affected by any natural law. Everything happened in slow motion, as I felt more and more paralyzed by fear. My mind screamed for me to escape, but my body simply wouldn't obey. I could only stay there, watching that terrifying scene unfold before my eyes. As the patient drew closer, a chilling sensation took over me. Her eyes seemed to pierce my soul, and a dark aura enveloped her. I could feel a negative energy, almost tangible, emanating from her. When she finally got close enough, she raised one hand towards me, as if to attack. At that moment, I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst. But instead of an impact, I heard a deafening sound, followed by a sharp cry from my colleague. Upon opening my eyes, I saw the patient lying on the floor, her body twisted in a grotesque position. My colleagues, terrified, quickly backed away. Then, to my surprise, she got up again as if nothing had happened. That scene was simply unbelievable. Nothing we saw seemed to obey the laws of nature. I felt like I was in a nightmare, unable to escape from that terrifying reality. Not knowing what to do, we followed her, walking through the dark and gloomy hospital corridors. I felt like something was watching us, a malevolent presence that seemed to feed on our fear. My steps were trembling, and I could barely control my panting breath. Finally, we reached the main lobby, where the patient disappeared through the front door. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do. We were all shaken, traumatized by what we had just witnessed. That experience had left an indelible mark on all of us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I tried to rest, the images of that possessed woman returned to haunt my mind. Her vacant stare, her supernatural movements, and that sense of negative energy haunted me, keeping me in a constant state of alert. In the days that followed, I tried to understand what had happened, but I found no plausible explanations. My colleagues and I discussed the matter, trying to rationalize what we had experienced, but nothing seemed to make sense. That event had deeply shaken our beliefs and our understanding of the world. Since then, I have been more attentive to any unusual signs or inexplicable phenomena that may occur in the hospital. I clearly remember another horrifying night I experienced during my shift at the hospital. Everything was going normally until I was called to attend to a patient in the intensive care unit. Upon entering the room, I found an elderly man visibly distressed and agitated. He seemed to have had a panic attack and refused to calm down, despite the efforts of my colleagues. His gaze was restless, and he kept staring at the corners of the room, as if he saw something that we couldn't perceive. After a brief assessment, we decided to administer some medications to calm him down and try to figure out what was causing such an intense reaction. As we administered the medication, the patient looked at us with despair and started mumbling incoherent words. "They are here. I can't get rid of them," he exclaimed with a trembling voice. This left me deeply intrigued and somewhat apprehensive. What could he be seeing that we couldn't understand? As time passed, the patient's condition seemed to stabilize, and he finally started to relax a bit. I took the opportunity to approach him and try to get more information about what was disturbing him so much. It was then that he looked at me with a terrified expression and revealed something that completely shocked me. "I can see them. The spirits of the dead, they are all over the hospital." His words echoed in my mind, sending a chill down my spine. Could that man really be seeing something supernatural? I didn't know what to think, but his distress seemed genuine. Trying to stay calm, I continued the questioning, asking him what he was seeing. He then described in disturbing detail the presence of various ethereal and shadowy figures scattered throughout the hospital, some of them approaching the patients as if observing them with malice. As he spoke, a knot formed in my throat. It all seemed so unreal, so absurd, and yet the conviction in his eyes was undeniable. I couldn't simply ignore his claims. Reluctantly, I decided to report the situation to my superiors, hoping to get some kind of guidance. However, to my surprise, they simply dismissed me, stating that the patient was probably delirious due to the medication. Frustrated and concerned, I decided to continue monitoring the case because something told me that it wasn't just a delusion. I started visiting the patient more often, observing his tormented expression and his constant efforts to get rid of those presences he claimed to see. As the days went by, I noticed that he became increasingly agitated and disturbed. His descriptions of the spirits became more detailed and frightening. He said they followed him, tormented him, and that their presence in the hospital seemed to be growing. I must confess that, initially, I felt a certain reluctance to believe it all. After all, my training taught me to always seek rational explanations for phenomena. But the patient's anguish and despair were so palpable that I simply couldn't ignore them. One night, something happened that completely shattered my perception of reality. I was doing my rounds in the hospital corridors when suddenly I felt a strange presence. An intense cold ran through my body, and a cold shiver ran up my spine. Looking around, I noticed that the lights seemed to dim, creating unsettling shadows in the corners of the corridor. A sepulchral silence settled in, and I could hear my own heart beating rapidly. Turning a corner, I came face to face with something that left me completely paralyzed. A nebulous figure, with smoky outlines, floated a few meters away. My wide eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. That presence stared at me with a dark expression, as if it could pierce my soul. I felt a sense of unease and apprehension take hold of me, and my body simply froze, unable to move. Trapped in that moment of terror, I remembered the patient's words and began to question whether what I was witnessing was indeed something supernatural. Was he telling the truth all along? Slowly, the figure started to dissipate, fading away. When I finally managed to snap out of the shock, I ran back to the patient's room, gasping for breath. Upon arriving there, I found him lying in his bed, with a distant and defeated look. Without hesitation, I questioned him about what he had seen in the corridor. His words left me even more stunned. "You saw them, didn't you? The spirits that I try to avoid at all costs. They're everywhere in this hospital." At that moment, I could no longer question his sanity. Something inside me told me that what he was claiming was indeed true. My skepticism had given way to a deep unease, and for the first time, I felt afraid of what might be inhabiting those facilities. In the following days, I kept a close eye on the hospital, looking for signs of those presences the patient described, and, to my horror, I started noticing small changes, such as flickering lights, strange sounds, and even the sensation of being watched. I shared my observations with my colleagues, but as before, they did not take my concerns seriously. Some even advised me to seek psychological help, claiming that I was becoming paranoid. However, I knew it wasn't just paranoia. Something was happening in that hospital, something that went beyond conventional scientific understanding. And at that moment, I felt a huge responsibility to investigate and understand that hidden reality that seemed to permeate that environment. Since then, I have remained attentive to any unusual signs, recording my observations and seeking ways to prove the existence of those supernatural entities. I know my colleagues may think I'm going crazy, but my conviction is unwavering. After what I saw that night in the corridor, I can no longer simply ignore the possibility that there are forces and phenomena that escape our rational understanding. And as a nurse, I feel that I have a duty to unravel this mystery, not only to protect my patients, but also to better understand the true nature of the reality that surrounds us. My name is Rachel, and I am a 42-year-old woman, born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. I am of Irish descent and grew up in a middle-class family. From a young age, I always stood out for my determination and ambition. On weekends, the family enjoyed outings to the countryside, where I developed my passion for nature. I loved hiking the trails and observing the animals. My parents, Michael and Caitlin, taught me to respect the environment from an early age. Since I was little, I was always a curious and energetic child. Growing up in Boston, I loved exploring the city, especially the parks and libraries. My parents encouraged me to read a lot and always question the world around me. At the age of 12, I decided to start volunteering at a local daycare, helping take care of the children. This experience inspired me to want to pursue a career focused on helping others. During high school, I worked as hard as I could, achieving excellent grades and getting involved in various extracurricular activities. I participated in the debate club, the swim team, and was president of the student council. This effort earned me a full scholarship to Harvard University. I remember the day I received my acceptance letter from Harvard. I was so excited that I couldn't believe it. My parents were thrilled and supported me every step of the way to university. It was a time of hard work and dedication, but also of discovery and personal growth. At Harvard, I had the opportunity to broaden my horizons, meet brilliant people, and delve into the study of business administration. My great passion. I graduated with a degree in hand and an unwavering determination to succeed. Without wasting any time, I joined a prestigious consulting firm in New York, where I quickly climbed the career ladder, becoming a senior manager by the age of 30. After my rapid career ascent, life seemed perfect. I had a successful job, a beautiful house in New York, and a network of friends and colleagues. However, something began to deeply disturb me. Some nights I would wake up scared, feeling like I wasn't alone in my room. I felt a strange presence, a dark energy that seemed to be watching me. Sometimes, objects would move on their own, or lights would flicker inexplicably. Initially, I thought it was just my imagination. After all, I had always been a very rational and logical person. But the incidents became more frequent and disturbing. Strange shadows crossed the hallways. Objects moved on their own, and I heard inexplicable whispers during the night. It was starting to really scare me. One night when I was alone at home, I heard deafening noises coming from the living room. My stomach turned, and a paralyzing fear took hold of me. With my heart racing, I forced myself to get up from the couch and approach the door. As I entered the living room, the air grew cold, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. In the dim light, I could glimpse a black, shapeless figure moving toward me. My knees trembled, and a scream of terror escaped my lips. I felt as if all my strength had left me, and a sense of total vulnerability washed over me. At that moment, I was certain that something supernatural and evil was present in my own home. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest as I stared at the shadowy figure approaching me. My mind went into panic mode, making me replay all the ghost stories I had ever heard. Could this really be an evil spirit? Was it going to attack me? Fear paralyzed every muscle in my body, leaving me completely at the mercy of that terrifying presence. Instinctively, I took a few steps back until I bumped into the wall. I looked around, searching for something, anything, that I could use to defend myself, but the room was empty, dark, as if everything had been sucked away by that sinister entity. Then, the shadow began to take shape, materializing more and more. I could distinguish a humanoid figure, but distorted, with long, twisted limbs. Its eyes glowed in a yellowish hue, piercing and full of malice. A shiver ran down my spine as our gazes met. Without thinking, I started to plead. asking it to go away, to leave me alone. But my voice sounded weak and trembling, lacking any strength. It seemed like that thing was sucking all my energy, all my courage. Suddenly, the shadow lunged toward me with superhuman speed. I closed my eyes, afraid of what might happen. Then, everything went dark and silent. When I reopened my eyes, the room was empty. The being had vanished. Trembling, I ran to turn on the lights, desperately needing brightness and safety. My whole body was cold with sweat, and my knees threatened to give out at any moment. The next day, still shaken and scared by what had happened, I decided to go to my closest friends, Lillian and Marcos, to tell them about the terrifying incident. As soon as I arrived, I could see from their faces that something was wrong. They seemed tense and worried. As soon as I started recounting what I had experienced the previous night, Lillian covered her mouth, horrified. "Oh my God, Rachel, did you really see that?" she exclaimed, her eyes wide. Marcos, who had always been a calm and rational person, looked disturbed. He started pacing back and forth, running his hands nervously through his hair. "This is not something to be taken lightly," he said gravely. "You need to be very careful. These things are not to be taken lightly." Confused and apprehensive, I pressed them to tell me what they knew. That was when they revealed something that left me even more terrified. Apparently, my house had a dark history. Decades ago, a family living there had suffered a tragedy. The father, having gone insane, had murdered his wife and 2 children before committing suicide. Since then, rumors circulated that the house was haunted by the spirit of that man. As the horrifying details came to light, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't believe that something so terrible had happened in the place I called home, and worse, that evil presence was still haunting the halls. Lillian and Marcos insisted that I should move out immediately before it was too late, but the idea of leaving my home and my life behind made me even more frightened and distressed. What was I going to do now? Stunned by my friend's revelations, I knew I needed to understand better the story behind that haunted house. My mind was racing with questions and theories. What exactly had happened in that place? Who were these people? And why did their evil spirits seem to be haunting me? I decided that the only way to get answers was to dive deep into research. I started by doing an internet search, but the information was scarce and superficial. I realized I would have to go beyond public records. So, I decided to visit the city hall, hoping to find more detailed documents and records about the old family that lived in my house. I would have to dig deep into the past, no matter how dark and disturbing it might be. Upon arrival, I explained my situation to the employees, begging for any relevant information. After some persistence, they finally located some old files about the case. What I discovered shocked me deeply. The family that lived in my house was led by a man named Nathaniel, who worked as an accountant at a large firm. He was considered a respectable and good-natured citizen by the community. However, the records revealed that at some point Nathaniel began showing signs of mental instability. He became increasingly irritable, aggressive, and paranoid, until on a fateful night Nathaniel completely lost his mind. According to the reports, he murdered his wife Eliza and their 2 small children before taking his own life. No one knew for sure what had triggered that explosion of violence, but authorities suspected undiagnosed mental issues. Shivering at the details, I realized that the legend of the haunted house was true. Nathaniel's spirit still seemed to be there, tormenting anyone who lived in that place. Now I understood the origin of that evil presence that was terrorizing me. But was this just the tip of the iceberg? What more could I discover about this dark story? And, most importantly, what should I do to rid myself of this ghost from the past? I knew I needed to dig deeper into this story. I decided to start investigating Nathaniel's past, trying to understand what could have led such a respectable man to commit such horrific acts. I returned to the old records, sifted through newspaper archives, and consulted police notes. I found out that Nathaniel had sought medical help a few times before the incident. He complained of severe headaches, disturbing visions, and tormenting voices. The doctors of the time couldn't identify a specific cause, and his condition worsened by the day. His medical history was full of sedative and tranquilizer prescriptions, suggesting that he was struggling with something far beyond the physical. The community, which initially saw Nathaniel as a pillar, began to avoid him. There were reports from neighbors who heard screams coming from the house at night, and some claimed to have seen Nathaniel wandering the streets, murmuring incomprehensible things. The tension within the house grew, and Eliza, his wife, seemed increasingly concerned about the safety of their children. One detail in particular caught my attention: a diary belonging to Eliza. In it, she described Nathaniel's increasingly erratic behavior and mentioned finding a strange book in his collection. This book seemed to be a kind of grimoire, full of symbols and texts in languages she couldn't understand. She suspected that Nathaniel was trying to perform some kind of ritual to alleviate his pains and silence the voices. Curious and scared, I decided to return home and search for that book. Maybe it could give me some clue as to what exactly Nathaniel had been involved in, and how I could rid myself of his presence. As I rummaged through the old house, I found a hidden compartment in the basement. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, was the book Eliza had mentioned. It was heavy, with an ancient leather cover and yellowed pages. The symbols and languages were indeed strange, but there were also handwritten notes in Nathaniel's handwriting. As I flipped through the pages, a chill ran down my spine. The rituals described there were dark and disturbing, involving invocations of entities from beyond our world. I realized that Nathaniel had been trying to invoke something sinister in a desperate attempt to find peace. With trembling hands, I continued reading, trying to understand the nature of the entity he had summoned. The more I read, the clearer it became that Nathaniel had brought a dark and malevolent force into our world, and now it was tormenting me. But there was also hope. Among the notes, I found instructions for a ritual of banishment, a way to send the entity back to where it came from. I knew it wouldn't be easy and I would need all the courage and determination I had, but I couldn't let fear control me. That night, I gathered the necessary materials and prepared to perform the ritual. As I started the incantations, the air grew cold, and the shadows in the room seemed to come to life. The presence of the entity was palpable, and I could feel its anger and resistance. With each word I recited, the room seemed to shake, and a chilling wind howled through the walls. But I continued, determined to banish that evil presence from my life once and for all. Finally, with a final cry, I completed the ritual. There was a deafening silence, and then suddenly, everything calmed down. The air became lighter, and I felt a sense of peace and relief wash over me. Nathaniel's spirit was gone, and I knew I was finally free from his torment. I had faced my fears and emerged victorious. And now I could move on with my life, free from the darkness of the past.